Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. I'm Jess Larson. Today on the show, we've got Bob Dalton.
I think that just the secret sauce in that is just not giving up. And so if it's a good idea and you're allowed to pursue that idea, and even if you have the lack of resources, I think the key to it was just not giving up. I think that's the only way that it could have worked, because I'd walk into a shop and I'd people say some really crazy stuff to me, and I had to.
Bob, thanks for making time.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So for people who don't know Sackcloth and Ashes, let's start off with the elevator pitch.
Yeah, so for every blanket that somebody purchases from Sackcloth and Ashes, we donate a second blanket to your local homeless shelter.
And how long ago did you start the company?
Started in 2014, so about 4.5 years ago.
Yeah. I know that you guys have had some pretty awesome things happening lately. We've obviously got Lindsay Hadley as a friend in common here. She's been on the show, and longtime friend of ours, used to run our charity Child Rescue. And pretty excited for the kind of progress you guys have made. I just saw the Kevin Bacon video. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so recently we launched a campaign with Kevin Bacon. We pitched a campaign to him, his charity, 6degrees.org, right before Christmas this in 2018. And they got back to us the next day, and they were like, can Bob fly to Kevin's house tomorrow? It was like 4 days before Christmas. So I got on a plane the next day, typed up a script, and we shot a video for the campaign. The campaign is from January 15 through 30, so we're at the tail end of it. And for every blanket that somebody purchases by using the code 6degrees on our website, sackclothandashes.com, we'll donate 20% of the proceeds to 6degrees.org, and we're going to provide a second blanket to the families that were affected by the California fires.
Well, and this is something I want to talk about. We're going to get more into the backstory and have you talk about your mom and these kind of things. But when you think about takeaways and principles that if people, somebody who's leading a team that might be listening today, as they're thinking about things they can bring back to their organization and principles to try to adapt to their industry, the one-for-one model, people are probably really familiar with Tom Shoes and the other, Warby Parkers of the world, stuff like this. Can you talk about this idea of the local aspect to it? Because I feel like that's something that really sets you guys apart.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Blake did such an incredible job pioneering the one-for-one model. And I was familiar with it, and it's obviously what inspired what I do. And so I saw Tom's, I think, was about 8 years old when by the time that I actually came up with Sackcloth and Ashes. And I felt like the one-for-one business model was incredible, but I felt like there needed to be an evolution to that business model. And I believe the evolution is local. I think we need to focus on our own societies and our own backyards. And I think there's a lot of work to do here in the United States. I think making a global difference is incredible, and I think making a local difference is the near future. And I think empowering people to make a difference locally is the next step.
I think for me, it takes the idea of giving a blanket to someone who's homeless from an abstract to something so much more tangible, because, like for instance, Salt Lake has a big homeless issue they've been working with, and it's a very visible thing society here is dealing with. And, I think about guys that I give a protein bar out the window, at the stop sign or something, right? And for me, when Lindsay was telling me your story, that was, that was just kind of a tweak. It was something fresh, but it also made it more of like a human connection, because I wasn't thinking about homeless people in the abstract. I was actually thinking about people I'd met or, folks I'd seen driving around. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's a very local issue, right? It's we drive by the folks all the time on the street. And so, yeah, I thought local was going to be the evolution to it. So what we do is we donate based on zip code. So if you live in Austin, Texas, and you buy a blanket, we'll send a blanket to a homeless shelter in Austin, Texas. If you live in Nashville, Tennessee, and you buy a blanket, we'll send a blanket to a shelter in Nashville, Tennessee. We donate to about 500 shelters in the U.S. So if you buy a blanket, our goal is to donate a second blanket to a shelter down the street from your house, so you're making an impact locally.
Yeah. Well, thinking about this principle, this kind of making it more human, making it more of a connection, Any thoughts for people in other industries? You know, most people are in a business that have competitors that do something pretty similar to what they do. You know, we all try to differentiate, but there's a lot of similarities in competition. Any thoughts for people in other industries of ways to think about making it more personal, making it more local, making it more connected in whatever space they're in?
Yeah, I would say really at some point, somebody has to go onto the ground level and kind of see and understand what's going on. And so one of the most powerful things that I get to be a part of is inviting executives of companies who don't normally get to kind of experience things on a ground level, and invite them into an experience at a homeless shelter and give them a tour and pass out blankets to folks on the street. And through educating yourself on a ground level, you're going to be awakened to what you can do and what you can call your team into, just in a really practical way.
You know, you think about that principle, and like anybody who's read any of the IDEO books or about, you know, the guys who thought up design thinking, they're constantly talking about human-centered design and going and observing, right?
Yeah.
And like, I know one of the stories in their book about these people who had product designers that had created these great turnstiles at an airport in France that were just really aesthetically pleasing. But by going and seeing it, they realized how ineffectual they were because they were too thin for a regular briefcase, a regular suitcase to fit through, and every passenger had to stop and lift it over the turnstile. These like great designs aesthetically were not functional because they hadn't gone and seen it in person, right?
Yeah.
Or like you look at like the Toyota production system and all the lean and continuous improvement folks, they're always talking about, you know, their Japanese term of like go to the Gemba and see it in person, right?
Yep.
So, you know, like most truths, they've been around for generations. Why do you think it's so tempting for us as leaders to sit in our offices with Excel spreadsheets or go to meetings and get a report? Why do you think so many of us don't pay that price to take time and just go, like, you know, Tom Peters calls it managing by wandering around, right? Like going to the location in person. Why do you think there's like that human tendency to just sit in our office and have staff bring information to us as leaders?
Yeah, two reasons. One, it's more safe. You know, you don't have to expose yourself to real issues or problems in your own community, because that's hard. That's really hard to actually accept that. I mean, Princeton did a study where when we drive by people on the street, we process them as objects. And so it's difficult to accept that there's actually issues and problems in the city. So it's safe. It's easy to sit behind your desk. Secondly, because most companies are money focused and ROI driven. And so the idea of taking time to make a difference or to give doesn't financially make sense to a lot of people. But yeah.
Yeah. You know, what's funny is that it's almost like a false efficiency, though, because even if it's like whether it's part of a company's corporate social responsibility or program or not, going and seeing customers use your stuff in person and going and seeing like the production floor, these are things that have such drastic benefits from the people that do it, but is something that's not very common, right? And as you were saying that, I was thinking I liked both your answers because you're right. If you're the boss's, if you're the manager's boss, you don't really have to hear complaints from the ground level staff directly if you don't go hang out with them in person, right? Like there is that like intellectual safety of like, no, I'm running a good company when you don't have to go hear the complaints yourself, right?
Totally. Yeah.
And then the other thing of that efficiency of like, I don't have the time. I don't have the time to go see it. I think it's, again, easy to like, blow on my fingernails and wipe them on my shirt if I'm a big deal. Like I know this space, I know this industry, right? And and instead of being like curious for what's different, I'm looking for information that confirms I already know what I'm doing. And look at all this 150 unread emails. I don't have time to go see stuff in person. But then things fester and problems get worse inside a company, or people aren't making those leaps that the way we've done things is not the way our customers want them done in the future. You're not seeing that in person, right?
Yeah, it's easy to sit at a table and eat, and it's hard to step on the scale.
I like that. Well, listen, for folks who don't know, can you tell us a little bit more about the origins of of where you got this idea for the company from?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2014, my mother was going through a pretty rough time in her life, and she needed a fresh start. And so she called me one day, and she said, Bob, I'm selling everything I have left on Craigslist, and I'm going to book a one-way plane ticket from Oregon to Florida, and I'm going to start my life over. And within 3 days, she sold everything she had left, and she took a suitcase with 2 pairs of interview clothes and flew from Oregon to Florida. And she thought her aunt would take her in, and her aunt didn't take her in, so she ended up sleeping on beaches and benches for about 2 months. And that completely changed my paradigm of how I understand the homeless community, because my mother was the last person that I would think would actually end up on the streets. She has 2 college degrees. She's managed restaurants her entire life. She raised my sister and I primarily by herself, and hardest working woman that I know. And so through her story, it taught me that not all people choose to become homeless. Some people just need a second chance. And it inspired me to call my local homeless shelters and ask what they needed. And they all said blankets. And that's when I came up with the idea that for every blanket somebody purchases from our company, we'll donate a blanket to your local homeless shelter. And for a while, I sat on the idea, because we all know that there's a huge gap between having a great idea and doing it. And so I sat on the idea for a while, shared it with some friends, and they were like, you got to pursue that. And I didn't do anything about it. And so one day, it's about like April 2014, I'm sitting in my car, my seat's leaned back all the way, my knees are up on the steering wheel, and my coffee cup is on my knee. And I'm just having like one of those what is the meaning of life moments. I'm transitioning, I'm applying for jobs, I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do.
Because what had you been doing before?
I was working with an organization called Young Life, and working with kids in high schools. And I was 24 at the time, and I was just transitioning out of Young Life, and just wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And it was a pretty difficult place. I was applying for jobs. Nobody was getting back to me. And my mom's going through that difficult time. And it was a really rough season. It was the first season that I had ever experienced like real depression. And so I'm sitting in my car and, trying to figure out what my next moves are. And I look up, and on my coffee cup that's sitting on my knee, on the coffee sleeve, it says, "What are you waiting for?" And my first thought was, what the hell coffee company puts quotes on their sleeves, And then, I was like, that was my moment. That was the moment that really, like, I was convinced that I was going to give everything I had to this vision. And so I pulled my phone out. I took a photo of that coffee cup, and I told myself in that moment that I'm going to blow that photo up on a TED Talk screen one day and tell the story that was about to happen. And started my car, drove straight down to Joann's Fabric and bought a roll of fabric, because that's what you do when you're starting a blanket company. and drained my savings account, bought a sewing machine, and took it home, and walked into my house, and my wife was like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Babe, I'm starting a blanket company." and she thought I was losing my mind. And I realized very quickly I can't sew, and had to outsource that to local sewists. And they started making me blankets. And the only thing I knew about business was the power of perception. If I could get people to become aware of what I was doing, it could work. And so I hired the best photographers that I could and got good photography. And I hustled up and down the Oregon coast and walked into shops and, just explained, this is why you need to buy these blankets over the blankets on your shelf, because I'm going to drive down to your local homeless shelter and donate the blankets in my trunk. And I got into about 20 shops out of 200. And June 1st of 2014, sackclothandashes.com went live with beautiful photography in 20 shops, and it totally looked like I knew what I was doing.
Well, they are great blankets. Lindsay got us one for Christmas, and my wife brings it in the car with her, and it's soft, and she just brings it around with her. She got the royal black one, but it's interesting, this idea. There's so many folks, we get the TED Talks, or we get the business literature about disruptive innovation and trying something new, which by definition, if you're, the kind of like Harvard professor Clayton Christensen guy who coined the term disruptive innovation, he's saying go after people who aren't consuming this already. Don't just go after the competition, go after the non-consumers. But there's not data on that. It really is like placing these small bets and going out and trying stuff. And don't gamble so big that you go broke if you're wrong on one. But you think about this idea of getting 180 no's in order to get into 20 shops. It's in some ways it's like it's cliche. It's like the story you always hear, and so it shouldn't scare us that much, right? To go get 180 no's in order to get 20 yeses. But but so many of us, we sit around drinking our coffees and not going home and buying the roll of Joanne fabric for whatever the new thing is we want to do or the experiment we want to do. Any thoughts for folks who they want to experiment, they want to go out on the limb, they want to push their team into something innovative, but maybe the organization they're with hasn't always made it easy for them? Any tips for going out and doing something that's not easy, like getting 180 no's?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just the secret sauce in that is just not giving up. And so if it's a good idea and you're allowed to pursue that idea, and even if you have the lack of resources, I think the key to it was just not giving up. I think that's the only way that it could have worked, because I'd walk into a shop and people say some really crazy stuff to me, and I had to shake it off and go straight into the next one. It really set a precedent to this story of Sackcloth in general, of just like, we've probably gotten 9 no's for every yes, and so I'm no longer scared of no's. I'm no longer discouraged by no's. I just continue to pursue what I feel passionate about and what I feel like I'm supposed to do, and continue to pursue that until it works.
I love it. Well, I know we're about up with time for part 1 of the episode, but this is actually something I want to talk about on part 2. So everybody, please tune back in, catch part 2 of the episode. We're going to keep asking Bob about the guts to persevere, even when it's not easy. Thanks so much. Well, that's it for the episode. One other thing I wanted to tell you about, if you'll remember the guys from Convoy in episodes back, Ken Free and Trent Mano, I went on one of their CEO trips to New York, and I met a guy named Brent Thompson, very successful entrepreneur. He was former CEO of Jive Communications, big company now, I think $300 or $400 million. Anyways, he started a new company called blipbillboards.com. I'm super stoked they're a sponsor now. But I remember a year and some ago when I met him, I thought it was genius. Instead of having to buy 6 months or a year's worth of billboard for thousands of dollars, you can buy 8 seconds at a time for like 10 or 20 cents. You pick what billboard you want it on, what time of day you want it to run. And it just puts so much power in the hands of marketers and CEOs who want to try something and see if it works. You can buy as many or as few as you want, change it as many times as you want. I think now our podcast is being advertised on billboards in like 18 different states because we have these guys as sponsors. We're pretty excited about it. Hope you check out blipbillboards.com. Thanks.